Okay, we will start our third session of the day. Thank you to everyone for joining us again. I hope you're enjoying the symposium so far. This third session is more directly related to the Moses project. I know you've been hearing about it a little bit through the sessions, but this session is really focused on what Moses has been doing over the last few years. So I'm Wesley Flannery from Queen's University Belfast. I'm chairing this session. And Stephen has asked me to give a quick introduction to what Moses is about, but also our approach to developing sustainable pathways for the blue sectors we were looking at. So as you probably heard already, Moses is an Interreg 3-year project led by Stephen, who's hosting the symposium for the 2 days, and involved partners across the Atlantic arc, and you can see our affiliations on the right of the screen. So we partners from Ireland, Spain, Portugal, France, and the UK. Because of COVID, we got a slight extension, so it turned out to be a 42-month project, but we're coming to the end of it now. And what we're doing at the moment is dissemination, and this forms part of this. This work package that the case studies relate to was really done in conjunction with stakeholders about thinking about their blue growth, their sector in terms of blue growth, where it was going, and we have now published some pathways, sustainable pathways, which will be available on the Moses website. So the overall aim of Moses was really to dig down into what was happening in terms of blue growth across that Atlantic arc, all the way from the UK down to Portugal. And you can see our 5 main objectives on the screen. So we're really looking at, how have these sectors grown over the last 5 years? What are the pressures they're placing on the marine environment? What are the opportunities and benefits that they're providing to coastal communities, but also some of the risks that come from that? And then what this session is about is objective 4, which is really how do we develop more sustainable pathways for these sectors? So blue growth is good so long as it's sustainable, and we can't just have continuous growth. Has to be on some kind of sustainable pathway. It can't just keep growing over and over due to the planetary limits. So what I want to do is very briefly talk about how we tried to investigate the pathways that these blue sectors were on and how we developed more sustainable pathways going forward. And we borrowed this idea of the transition management lens, very much developed by the Drift Institute in the University of Rotterdam, where they looked at energy transitions and health transitions in the Netherlands. So we adopted this lens to investigate what was going on in the sectors we were interested in. I'll just very briefly talk you through it. So if you look at the middle of the diagram, this is the patchwork of regimes. It's currently how a sector is managed, but it also incorporates the norms that form part of the sectors, the rules, both informal and formal rules that make up a sector. And what those looking at transition management have said is that this regime tends to be very, very stable and very hard to change. And it tends to reproduce problems over and over again. So if you think about climate change, we've known about it for a long time, yet the institutions that should be managing and adapting to this, and some of the institutions that should be fading away, tend to be very resistant and are reproducing some of these issues. But what they've theorized through this lens is how do you actually implement change if this regime is so resistant? And they talk about 2 things putting pressure on the regime to change. First of all, it's the landscape level. So if you look at the top of the diagram, these tend to be things that are outside the control of the regime, yet put pressure on it. So climate change is one thing, worldviews, changing worldviews and culture, but also political pressure. So if you think about Brexit and the impact that has had on very long established sectors and how they've had to change, that's a good way of thinking of what these landscape pressures might be. But also you can have bottom-up pressures where there's novelty and innovation happening within a sector and it's trying to develop new practices. Now, what often happens is that these new practices are subsumed within the existing regime and they don't reach their full potential. So what the people who develop this lens are interested in thinking about is, if we're looking at the pathway over the next 5, 25, 50 years that these sectors on, can we identify the landscape pressures and innovations that are happening at the moment that could change these systems into something more sustainable. And rather than letting this happen organically and maybe the regime resisting it, we think about how we would steer a pathway where we benefit from a more sustainable regime as it's going forward. So we've adopted that in various ways across our case study areas, and you'll hear about that later today. So we have 6 sustainable blue pathways that we developed. You've heard about some of them in the other sessions. You'll hear about 4 of them here today. You'll hear from Christina Kelly from Queen's University Belfast on the port sector. You'll hear from Regis Kalajian about marine energy and the pathway in France. You'll hear from Rula Kierzarzi, she can correct me on that later, on aquaculture development in Portugal, and then Francis Fahy from NUIG about coastal tourism, the growth in that sector and the pathway that it's on. So that was a very quick overview of what we've done. We'd like to thank the funders again, Interreg, for this project, and particularly to thank all our stakeholders who've engaged with these pathways and the work that we've been doing over the last 3 years. So I'll hand over to Christina now to start our first presentation, and I'll introduce Christina while she's getting ready. So Christina Kelly is a research fellow here at the School of the Natural Built Environment in Queen's University Belfast. She's worked on the Moses project for the last 3 years. In February, she moved over to a new project that we have looking again at port sustainability. Her PhD was on integrated management in estuaries, but before she came back to undertake her PhD, she worked in terrestrial planning, but also marine planning. I think Christina was probably the first, or one of the first, marine planners in Europe, and developed a plan for the Shetlands. So over to you, Christina, to give us an overview of this case study.
Thank you, Wesley. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to present our research findings. So my presentation is on the Blue Growth Pathway for Ports Development in the Atlantic area, and it's based on the work we conducted as part of our case study with Belfast Harbour. So just some background information. The maritime industry, with around 90% of global trade by volume and 70% by value, is one of the most globalized and largest industry sectors in the world. And international seaborne trade volumes reached 10.7 billion tonnes in 2017. So that represents a growth rate of 4% over previous 5 years, with shipping greater than 80% of merchandise trade and transport. So with that growth in maritime trade, there's been a growth in emissions. So global maritime transport, it's estimated to emit around 940 million tonnes of CO2 annually. So that accounts for 2.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So actually international shipping consumes as much fuel as the entire energy requirements for Germany. So that goes to show how significant it is. And in terms of trying to sustain that growth and the growth in emissions, the IMO has committed to a reduction of 50% in carbon emissions by 2050 in the shipping sector. So there really is a need for transition towards greater sustainability, and in particular decarbonisation. There has been some estimates of growth in terms of emissions in the shipping sector between 50 and 250% by 2050. So it's a critical point at the moment with regards to sustainability in the ports and shipping sector. In terms of port management and the types of regimes, it's quite complex, with ports having varying functions, roles and assets, which are often affected by economy, politics and geographical location. And ports activities are managed under different forms of port administration and ownership. Some ports, for example, are owned by local government, or some have private public shared services. So again, they're the different types of management regimes. And also the management of port activities is quite fragmented, with the International Maritime Organization having responsibility for regulating shipping at sea. You have the EU, who regulates through directives, emissions, energy efficiency, pollution, and also there's the policies of national government and local authorities as well. In ports, there are varying degrees of environmental and innovation initiatives and policies being carried out. The majority of ports do have their own environmental management and monitoring systems, same for energy management. Some ports are part of the EcoPorts network in Europe, managed by ESPO. Other ports have been designated green ports, and some are striving to become smart ports with a greater emphasis on innovation and technology. In terms of sustainability and management, there are a number of barriers and constraints which have been acknowledged, such as the complexities of regulations, the lack of data to monitor environmental impacts. This fragmentation has resulted in a lack of standardization across technological interventions, integrating customer requirements into emerging sustainability approaches. And also there is the competition between ports, as well as competition between cities and ports for land use development. These all are constraints or represent barriers towards achieving greater sustainability. As Wesley mentioned, as part of the case studies, we have incorporated a transition management approach, a framework to look at transitioning towards greater sustainability. And with transition management, it's rather than looking at incremental change, it looks at transformation and transformative changes that can deal with complexity and uncertainty. And that is why we've used the transition management approach in the Belfast Harbour case study. In transition management, it's a process, and normally it encompasses 4 phases. And the first phase is the development or the establishment of a transition arena. The second phase involves envisioning, looking at a long-term vision. The third phase, which I won't go into, we didn't have time as part of our case study to go into the third and fourth phases, looks at experimentation and scaling up of niches. And the fourth phase of transition management looks at reflexivity and evaluation. But as part of Belfast Harbour, we incorporated the first 2 phases of the transition management approach. The first one was developing a transition arena. So that's based on participation and bringing stakeholders together. So in our case study at Belfast Harbour, we initially devised a list of stakeholders, and then we conducted some online interviews and some online questionnaires with them. And then we brought people together in a workshop setting at Belfast Harbour in 2019, where we explored opportunities and challenges, drivers and barriers in transitioning towards sustainability. We wanted the stakeholders with an interest in Belfast Harbour to be involved in this process. And as part of that workshop, we identified priorities for transitioning towards sustainability within Belfast Harbour. And coming out of those first engagement exercises, we find that there was a focus on the short to medium term in terms of Belfast Harbour and the management of it, and there was a lack of future thinking or thinking about the longer term perspective. So as part of phase 2, where we were looking at the envisioning aspect of transition management, as Belfast Harbour had recently developed their own strategy, a vision to 2035, we decided the emphasis should be on horizon scanning and future thinking over the longer term perspective. And this involves the application of an innovation and technology element to their future thinking. So using an in-depth review of the academic literature and best practice, we devised a future pathways analysis approach. And this is an approach which looks at assessing how ports can respond to a number of change drivers over the short, medium and long term. And as part of the pathway analysis, it involves 3 key elements. And the first element involves examining external and internal change drivers. And we use a PESTEL framework to categorize those different change drivers. So we categorize them according to politics, the economy, society, technological, legislative and environmental drivers. Then we looked at the potential impacts of these drivers over 3 timeframes, and the 3 timeframes involve the short, medium and long term. And then we looked at developing pathways or responses to these drivers over the 3 timeframes. And as part of the future pathways, we describe the pathways or scenarios as narratives, just to explain how the potential future pathways could respond to these change drivers. So building on the feedback we got from those initial stakeholder consultations on drivers and pressures, we also looked at the academic literature around drivers of change. And this illustration just kind of summarizes the future pathways. So just at the narrow end of the cone, we have the different drivers: the economy, environment, society, technology, and we incorporated the policy and the legislative drivers within those. And the different timeframes we chose were 2025, 2035, and 2050. And the 3 different pathways we presented were based on a stable futures approach, a disruption resilience approach, and a managed innovation. So these were 3 different types of approaches that could respond to the different drivers. So the stable future was based on previous experience and future predictions to enhance greater efficiency and effectiveness of port operations, and the focus was on the short term. The disruption and resilience approach would look to foster greater resilience and a capacity to respond to unknown shocks, and it was very much based on a risk management approach and over the medium term. And then a managed innovation pathway looked at utilising innovation to flexibly steer towards change over the longer term. So we presented these 3 different pathways in a report, a future pathways analysis report, along with a video which we presented with 10 different organisations with an interest in Belfast Harbour. And within the presentation and the reports which we provided prior to meeting with the different stakeholders, we had an interactive questioning session, and we wanted to find out what the stakeholders felt Belfast Harbour were doing in terms of future thinking, but also their own organisations, how they were thinking about the longer term. So the findings from that future pathways analysis approach, where we went to the stakeholders, we found that there was a lot of the stakeholders felt that Belfast Harbour, but also their own organisations, there was a disinclination to plan beyond the medium term, that future thinking tended to be based around financial and infrastructure planning cycles and risk management approaches. And some of the stakeholders felt that there was a need to consider an alternative economic model, one that was more sustainable and looked at growth within planetary boundaries rather than just continuous growth. The stakeholders felt that there was a lack of planning or foresight in terms of pandemics or major political change. So those unplanned shocks that tended to result in a more of a reactive instead of a proactive response from ports, as well as the port-related organisations. It was felt also that climate change impacts and adaptation was not to the forefront. There was a lack of urgency there. However, climate change mitigation was seen as an opportunity, particularly in terms of decarbonisation and looking at alternatives to the fossil fuels. Stakeholders felt that there was a need for greater investment in training, particularly where innovation is seen as a new element towards port operations and the management of port activities, greater investment in new technologies, engineering, manufacturing and design, and that workforce that is going to enable that advancement in the technology. Greater collaboration between ports as well as the city administrations, academia, business and local communities should also be promoted. I've included a quotation there from one of the interviewees where they had stated that governance systems that are built on collaboration, equality, diversity and mixed gender tend to do better than others. In terms of learning from best practice and different phases of progress, it was suggested that we need to be aware of the scalability and timing issues, and to be aware that other ports were at different phases of progress. It was suggested that there was a hesitancy to grasp innovation and to take risks, and there wasn't an evaluation of the value of acting against not acting, particularly in terms of surviving economic shocks. Some felt that there was a lack of business diversity within Belfast Harbour and the Harbour estate, and particularly around maybe the waterfront facilities and services. There seemed to be more of a demand for the human experience instead of service provision. And this was as a result of the COVID impact, where the value of open spaces and the leisure facilities and that waterfront experience was coming to the forefront. Regulatory barriers such as policy was hindering innovation, particularly for offshore renewables. And there was also an uncertainty over the role of ports in contributing to citywide change. So the majority supported a managed innovation approach over the longer term, but this approach should foster resilience and adaptability, as well as embracing innovation and technology to flexibly steer long-term change. So just in terms of our recommendations, we feel that there's a need for ports to plan for change over the longer term to achieve sustainable blue growth. We felt that the PESTEL framework, which we use to categorise change drivers, could be used with key port stakeholders. And I won't go through this, but there where we've highlighted the different drivers according to politics, the economy, society over the short term, medium term and long term was very useful to identify what was driving change. We recommend using a future pathways analysis approach similar to the one we applied in our case study, and that a participatory process that enables stakeholders to explore future development and desirable outcomes is welcome. In terms of the regional assemblies, we felt that collaborating with key stakeholders at EU, national, regional and local level, promoting enhanced coordination and sustainability in regional, local, spatial and economic strategies, and optimising EU policy and funding instruments for regional local development priorities, including innovative port infrastructure, is recommended. So that's a very brief overview of our case study. I want to thank our Belfast Harbour and their staff for supporting our research, and also the local stakeholders who participated in our stakeholder engagement exercises. Thank you, Wesley.
Thank you, Christina. I should have said at the start that we have a short poll at the end of each presentation, so this will come up for the attendees if you wouldn't mind completing that. And also, if you want to ask questions, if you could put it in the Q&A function, and I'll read it out. Just while we're waiting for that, Christina, maybe I'll abuse my position as chair and ask you a question. In terms of long-term thinking, I know from our experience that the port was really focused on the short and medium-term, risks or opportunities. Any idea why they were locked into not really thinking long-term? Even climate change, when they were thinking about that, it was almost short-term actions as well. I'm just wondering why that's such a short, maybe, time frame in terms of their own plans.
I think it was, they've been so used to planning around their financial, I suppose, that timeline, and also infrastructure projects. So they normally planned around those short to medium phases, and depending on investment and accounting. So it was, their recent strategy was what they could invest in over the next 5 years, but also the medium term in terms of project management and those greater infrastructural developments. So that was bringing up to 2035. So it's traditionally, that's just been the way that it's kind of worked. It's been around, and I suppose it's more around a risk management, financial risk management as well. In terms of climate change, I think possibly because there's a lack of policy at the moment in Northern Ireland, that that legislative driver hasn't been there at the moment. Although the port and obviously shipping, it's regulated under different organisations. I think within a local context, that climate change, the information, the science, the data, that probably has hindered that urgent thinking around it as well. So, but I think from our engagement with Belfast Harbour, they've started to think about the longer term, and they were interested in our approach, and that's looking at the different pathways and developing those different scenarios. And I know that at the moment they're looking at their sustainability strategy, and they are starting to think about that longer term. That's not just the short and medium term. I think they've realised that that's what they're going to have to think about.
Thanks for that. I don't see any other questions to be asked at the moment, so maybe I can ask Regis to start getting ready and to get your presentation while I introduce you. Thanks very much, Christina.
Thanks,
so
Les.
Regis will present from the work on IFMR in terms of what they were doing in terms of developing a blue pathway in terms of renewable energy. Regis is an economist. His main activities include being the editor of the French Marine Economic Data Report published by his institution, and he's been the partner or lead partner on a number of large projects. Before this, Regis was also involved in the project that occurred before Moses, the Marnet project, which really focused on developing some of the economic baselines that Moses developed or built on within the project. So once you're ready, Regis, I'll hand over to you. Again, if people want to ask questions, just use the Q&A function, and we'll have another poll at the end of Regis's presentation. Okay, over to you, Regis. Thanks very much. Hi, Regis. I don't know if we should be seeing anything, but all I can see at the moment is a black screen in a file folder. I don't know if anyone else can see anything else.
Excuse me, I have a problem.
Okay. Just while Regis is getting ready, I'll just also point out that in the chat, I posted the link to the reports that are now available on the website on each one of these case studies if people are interested in it.
I have a problem. Perhaps you could move on to the next speaker and I come back later.
No problem. Okay, we'll come back to you in a few minutes, Regis, or after the next presentation. Raula, I hope you're there and you're ready to roll live on short notice. Regis has an issue, so if you're able to bring up your presentation, that would be great.
Wes, perhaps it's visible now.
Okay, we'll go again. Thanks, Raula, for being on the ready though. Okay, over to you, Regis. We'll give it a go again.
Can you see the slide?
No, unfortunately, I can't.
Okay, perhaps you could move on to the next speaker. I am sorry, I have a problem.
No worries. We'll check in with you at the end of Raula's presentation. Raula, are you on standby again? Thank you so much for being ready. If you want to get your slides ready, I'll introduce you.
Okay.
Raula is an expert in marine spatial planning and ocean governance, has been working in our partner CMAR in Portugal for the duration of Moses, particularly looking at the growth of the aquaculture sector. She's also worked for academia, other research centres and NGOs, looking at stakeholder engagement and opportunities within marine spatial planning and also the marine economy. Over to you, Raula, and thanks again for stepping in at short notice.
So, hello everybody. I'm going to talk about the blue growth pathway for aquaculture development in the Atlantic area. We have worked on this case study with my colleague Agnes Marandur and my supervisors Joa Coimbra. We all work for CMAR. So I'm going to start. So some introductory notes. The blue economy currently provides around 5.4 million jobs in Europe and generates a gross added value of almost 500 billion a year. Aquaculture in the EU and the Atlantic Arc region is cited as one of the most promising areas, offering a high potential for the creation of sustainable jobs and growth. This growth, however, must be in line with sustainable development standards, a task that both governments and business must undertake. In this context, we examined how sustainable blue growth in aquaculture sector can be achieved over the long term, while addressing the complexities and uncertainties that affect this goal. For this purpose, we used a case study approach involving Portugal's central region aquaculture sector sustainability performance assessment in combination to a transition management approach in order to suggest a pathway towards sustainable blue growth in aquaculture. So, aquaculture is one of the blue growth sectors and one of the traditional Atlantic industries promoted by the Atlantic Action Plan. Specifically, under the first priority of the Atlantic Action Plan, promotion of entrepreneurship and innovation, the objective is to enhance competitiveness and innovation capacities by improving skills in the sector. Under priority 2, which is about protecting, securing and enhancing the marine and coastal environment, aquaculture can play an important role by providing healthy and sustainable fish and seafood production, while marine environmental protection is a requirement for aquaculture development. Under priority 4, create a socially inclusive and sustainable model of regional development. Aquaculture can impact on employment and has impact on employment and potential for collaborative research and development and the delivery of technological improvements and innovation at the regional level. So it's apparent that aquaculture is promoted by the Atlantic Action Plan. Aquaculture has a strong presence in the EU and the Atlantic Arc region. Currently, around 1.25 million tons are produced in the EU each year. 50% of this production is mollusks and crustaceans. 27% is marine fish and 23% is freshwater fish. Also currently around 85,000 people are directly employed in European aquaculture. In the Atlantic Arc region, the species that are most frequently farmed are Atlantic salmon, which is produced mainly in northern countries like Ireland and UK, and oysters and mussels that are produced are the focus of production for southern countries like France, Portugal, and Spain. So let's go now to the case study. The sector's blue growth potential and its contribution to local as well as national blue growth has been examined in the central region of Portugal. By collecting information from scientific and policy publications, statistical data sets and input from key actors, there were two aims. The first aim was to observe whether and how sustainability performance assessment of aquaculture in central region is happening, and if yes, which EU suggested indicators are used and what other indicators are suggested by interviewed experts and stakeholders. And the second aim was to apply the transition management approach as the rest of the case study that followed also this approach, that includes identification and assessment of drivers and barriers likely to impact the sustainable growth profile of aquaculture, and to suggest a blue growth pathway to boost the drivers and overcome the barriers. So we did some literature review of various policy documents such as the EU Blue Economy Report, some scientific guidelines from the Scientific and Technical Economic Committee for Fisheries. We used publications from the statistical agency here in Portugal, especially about fisheries and aquaculture, and other documents that refer to ocean policy in Portugal and blue growth, which is promoted lately in the country. Also, of course, scientific publications, and we combine this literature review with meetings with stakeholders that were included business, administrative people from administration, clusters, associations, and either in person and later due to the quarantine through Zoom. Some aquaculture facts and figures in Portugal and Central region. Here in this table, we can see it's taken by one of the reports from the statistical agency, where it says that in 2019, sales revenue was almost 97 million euros, with an increase of 18.5 since 2017. This is about the whole Portugal, including also Azores and Madeira. And we can see that in the central region had the second highest revenue after Algarve for both years. Central region was also second after Algarve in the number of enterprises in 2016, as we can see here on the map. And also it was second also in approved EMFF projects in 2016. So for this reason also it was one of the arguments to select this area to study, also because there is potential. There has been also recently a promotion of marine aquaculture offshore. So for the first goal, whether there is any sustainability performance assessment, we used indicators that are suggested by EU in the publication and approach towards European aquaculture performance indicators. They suggest a list of the minimum required. Of course, there are much more, and especially in scientific publications, we can find many suggestions, but these, at least at the EU level, they are suggested as the minimum required. From these 17 indicators, most of them, around 13 of them, are already assessed by at least 4 companies that we interviewed that operate in the region. But we need to take into account that the majority of the firms operating in the region are not real companies, like big companies. They are just family business, and in that case, most of this family business, they don't do any type of assessment. They only just check the basic ones, like the production and the gross value added, maybe, and the profitability and employment. From the side of the authorities, they also request most of these indicators. It was interesting to see that none of the governance performance indicators are assessed or are taken into consideration from neither of the categories of the stakeholders. And also, we should know that only the highlighted indicators that are publicly available there is publicly available information, and that companies did not provide any estimation of any of their indicators. So we couldn't do any estimation, at least so far, and based on the input from the interviews. But while we were conducting the interviews and we were doing also the literature review, we noticed that there are also some other indicators that are not included in this basic list from the EU. There are many economic performance indicators suggested by the Scientific, Technical and Economic Committee for Fisheries, and also some others which are suggested by the authorities, the Portuguese authorities. All these that are in highlighted in yellow, there are data published every year, especially in STCF. The interesting thing here is to highlight that the companies have also suggested, or even other stakeholders such as consultants, clusters and associations suggested also indicators that were not included in STCF or suggested by the Portuguese authorities. And these were about expenditure on research and development, expenditure on branding, and import-export ratio. These are also found in scientific publications. The most interesting in terms of sustainability assessment is a big number of environmental indicators that the companies highlighted that they already use. So this is already an indication that at least the companies that we have interviewed, they have interest in not only in the economic performance, but also in the environmental ones. Also social performance, some indicators that we didn't find in the literature, but suggested by the companies or by other stakeholders are interesting to explore and to see whether this could be even suggested in the literature. Let's go now to the application of the transition management approach in order to address the second goal of this research. As already has been said previously by Christina, transition management focuses on coordinating a wide range of factors with the aim of achieving long-term sustainability. It requires understanding of the interconnection between the current management regime, that is, refers to dominant practices, rules, institutions, and norms that structure activity within a particular policy area, and the change pressures, which are divided in landscape pressures and niche pressures. Landscape pressures are dynamic that put pressure on the existing regime to change, but cannot be directly controlled by the regime. So it can be economy, politics, population dynamics, etc. And niche pressures are mainly smaller scale actors who, with their practices, put pressure on the regime to adopt to accommodate them. Since we are talking about the Atlantic area, we checked the management regime both in the regional, also in the national and local level. So the management regime can have a picture of the management regime in the Atlantic area by identifying enabling factors and obstacles. Enabling factors were many policies that support the sustainable development of the sector, such as the common fishery policy, blue growth strategy, the strategic guidelines for the sustainable development of EU aquaculture, some environmental initiatives or policies, MSFD, OSPAR, the Atlantic Action Plan, and the European Green Deal, some funding mechanisms such as the EMFF, the Atlantic Ocean Research Alliance, and the Blue Source by the European Investment Bank. And then the obstacles that actually the obstacle here, mainly the problem here in the Atlantic area is that we cannot have a unified management regime because there are many countries involved and each country has differences. So there are differences in the requirements in place for environmental impact assessment, the uneven development of national policies for aquaculture, different administrative restrictions, and even application of regulation across countries, and of course different physical and climatic conditions, which apparently support different types of production in terms of species and also systems of production. Since we were focusing also at the local, national and local level in Portugal, we did the same. We identified enabling factors, which are again policy, funding. We have here in Portugal the Marine Situation Plan, the National Ocean Strategy, the satellite account for the sea, some economic, also at the region, at the local level, there's a strategic dedicated strategy for territorial development. Also some economic funding mechanisms, again, the operational program for the Central Region, PROMAR, MAR 2020. And also we identified enabling factors from the interviews. Some of them are that some types of aquaculture are allowed in protected areas. By the way, this is interviews and cross-checked with the literature. The high demand for fish products by the Portuguese, the low cost for licensing and using public land sea sites, the increased spending for research, the better quality of local vs imported products, and the growing demand for organic seaweed, organic clams, and locally produced oysters and corvine. On the other side, the obstacles that require to be addressed in order to improve this the current management regime. There are many, but not as many as the opportunities or the enabling factors. That's good. One important obstacle is that there are more than one aquaculture spatial planning framework, different for inland waters, different from marine waters, and different from transitional waters. Then another factor that has been highlighted also from the stakeholders was the lack of enthusiasm for collaboration and communication between different categories of key actors. The fact that aquaculture in Portugal is less competitive than in other areas of the Atlantic arc. There is not so much marketing about the aquaculture products to the consumers, and consumers are not convinced that aquaculture products are of good quality. The lack of conflict management between aquaculture and other uses, or at least of clear guidelines in the different plans that already exist. The competition with cheap imported aquaculture products that compete with local production. And the unproportional allocation of funding when it comes to projects from different companies. So just to...
Sorry, is this the last slide? Just what we've done with the
this one and one more, but I'm going to be fast.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah. So the conclusion is that there is an observed positive blue growth potential for aquaculture based on performance indicators used already and on the balance between enabling and disabling factors. This potential can be boosted further by addressing the following key priorities for Portugal that have been presented in the strategic plan for aquaculture. So the first priority is to simplify the administrative processes to reduce the deadlines and administrative steps needed for licensing. This priority has already been addressed to some extent. Still, there is space for improvement regarding the license processes. Then the other priority is to facilitate better spatial planning with aim to identifying areas with higher potential for aquaculture and reduce environmental impact. Again, this priority has been addressed since we have already the situation plan that was published in 2019, where they present many potential new sites for marine aquaculture offshore. And then the third priority is to reinforce the competitiveness of the aquaculture sector. And this priority again has been addressed by an initiative that that have been already identified to encourage greater investment for food safety standards and to promote additional research and planning for offshore aquaculture. Finally, and this is the last slide, the recommendation for the sector from a transition management perspective. So the landscape pressures result mainly from the increased demand for fish and seafood, as well as the need for sustainable food production, the need to address overexploitation of the marine resources, and the need to address adaptation to climate change. Then at this level, key actors such as research institutions, investors, producers, governments, agencies, consultants, and clusters have strongly linked interests in the blue economy and aquaculture within it, and can impact the blue growth transition pathway. And then the impact on the management regime at the end is that despite the differences between countries, the current management regimes for the Atlantic, Portugal, and the Central region correspond well to the change pressures set by both the landscape pressures and the niche practices, through a strong institutional framework and strategic planning practices already in place that we already mentioned previously. So some recommendation, especially to boost the niche level influence on the regime, is a stronger and more effective collaboration that is required between the key actors working across the sector at the local, national, and regional level. And it's also important to improve the effectiveness of aquaculture association, which in turn will help support investors and producers. That's it.
Joanna, very good.
Sorry.
Yeah, we can put up the poll, and I think we have time for one quick question. We have a couple, and maybe we can come back to the others at the end. But there's a question about the public perception of aquaculture. Particularly, I think in Ireland and the UK, there's quite a negative perception of aquaculture. And the question is, what is the public perception of aquaculture in Portugal? Is misinformation on the impacts of aquaculture as big an issue as it is elsewhere outside of Portugal?
We didn't, in our research, we didn't engage the wide public. So, to be honest, we didn't. Sorry, do I still share my screen here? Or no? No,
it's gone. Your screen's gone. That's fine.
So we didn't engage the public. But yes, from the interviews with stakeholders, also in publications, there is still bias regarding the aquaculture production, either in terms of the impact on the environment or in terms of the quality of the products. The stakeholders themselves, they support aquaculture, so they say that it's even the production is even competitive in terms of quality compared to the imports. But there should be some kind of strategy and some investment in marketing to promote the products and to highlight the good quality of the products. So this is a key issue that should be addressed: the communication of the benefits that this sector creates in the society, and this is lacking for the moment.
Okay. We have a couple of other questions, but maybe we can come back to those at the end. Thanks for that, Rala.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we can get Regis's presentation ready. I think our colleagues in the Whitaker Institute are going to control it for you, Regis. So Courtney, if you want to bring it up, and Regis can tell you when to move it on.
Okay, thank you to Courtney. Okay. Sorry for my mismanagement of this system. So this presentation is about offshore renewable energy in the Atlantic area. Next, please. Okay, thank you. Offshore renewables is a challenging sector because since it is a new growing sector, we have a poor information in terms of data on this sector. And the Moses database we talked about this morning has little amount of data available on offshore renewables, actually. The case study we made for Moses made a focus on Brittany, but this presentation is limited to the general situation in the Atlantic area. We'll briefly talk about the available technologies. We will say some words about the policy context, which matters for this new sector. And we'll discuss the blue growth pathway issue and discuss its sustainability. Next, please. Thank you. The general context of the development of offshore renewables is, of course, the climate change issue. However, the first wind farm, which was built in Europe, was built in Denmark in 1991, so much earlier, and it benefited from the onshore wind power technology, actually. And so Northern Europe was going ahead, and this explains the rapid growth of wind energy in Northern Europe. And an advantage, an interesting feature in Northern Europe is the shallow waters of the North Sea, the Baltic Sea, and the Irish Sea. This was very beneficial for the development of the industry and of wind farms. As regards the Atlantic area, so within the red border that you see on the picture, this area is very diverse. It includes the Irish Sea, which has wind farms on its eastern side, but elsewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, there is a much slower development of marine renewables in general, mainly because of its characteristics. I mean, in terms of deep waters, the Atlantic Ocean does not have many shallow water bodies, except in the Irish Sea, and this partly explains why this explains the slow development of marine renewables. However, it has strong currents locally, which are beneficial to other technologies. Next, please. Thank you. So in terms of technologies, wind energy might be seen in a broader context. Of course, offshore wind is the most mature technology and with the most rapid development. I talk about fixed foundation offshore wind here. A major technology is also tidal range energy that you can see on the picture, bottom left. It takes the shape of dams. Tidal range is also a major technology which developed earlier in the 60s. Now there are maturing and still costly technologies. For example, tidal stream. So, for example, marine current turbines that you can see on the picture bottom right. this is a maturing technology, but still costly. And floating wind turbines are also somewhat costly. In terms of cost, the average cost for offshore wind is around 50 euros per megawatt hour throughout lifetime. For tidal stream and marine current turbines, we are much higher at 300 euros per megawatt hour or more. For floating wind turbine, we are roughly speaking at between 80 and 100 euros per megawatt hour. The other technologies, are at the stage of research and pilot projects. Next, please. So this is a focus on offshore wind. You can see on the chart on the left, that the development was very rapid in Europe over the past decade, with UK being the world leader for offshore wind with fixed foundations. Germany recorded a rapid increase, a rapid development over the past 3 years or so. Denmark is a very important country because not specifically because of its of the capacity which is deployed off Denmark, but mainly because the number of businesses involved in wind power, in the wind power industry, are Danish, actually. Denmark developed very early. You can see on the map that most wind farms are located in the North Sea, in the Baltic Sea, and to the east of the Irish Sea. Next, please. So it's important to mention the policy context, because the development takes place in a policy context which is international, which is EU related, but which is also national and even regional, actually. It combines an environmental strategy, an energy strategy, and the marine strategy. In terms of environmental strategy, of course, the Paris Agreement of COP21 in 2015 is decisive, as well as the Green Deal, the EU Green Deal, which followed the Paris Agreement in 2019. These are very important milestone events. In terms of energy strategy, the recent offshore renewable energy strategy issued by the European Commission is essential, with a target of 240 gigawatts installed in terms of offshore renewables by 2050. This includes 300 gigawatts of wind farms, a fixed foundation, and 40 gigawatts of ocean energy, including floating turbines, including also marine current turbines and some pilot projects, and also tidal dams, as I showed on the previous slide. So this is an essential document which outlines the European approach for the development of offshore renewables for 3 decades. Next, please. Of course, there are national objectives as well as regional objectives. Usually national objectives, well, more or less in line with international objectives and especially EU objectives for Europe. And regional objectives generally are in line with the national ones. Well, you can see that the most ambitious objectives are those of UK and Scotland, with some new projects in Spain, Portugal, and France, with Brittany having the willingness to have ambitious targets in terms of submarine current turbines and floating wind. Next, please. So in terms of blue growth pathway, well, it is certain that a discussion on the blue growth pathway for offshore renewables has to, well, consider wind power as the main driver for that strategy, given the momentum which exists in several European countries in order to develop the wind power industry with fixed foundations or with floating turbines. However, the Atlantic area raises some complex issues because of its characteristics in terms of bathymetry, deep waters, although there are shallow waters in the Irish Sea. And another characteristic which has to be taken into account is strong currents for the Atlantic area. Given that, a reasonable option for the Atlantic area would be to combine fixed foundation farms with floating wind farms and considering a complementary option, namely tidal energy, including tidal plants and submarine current turbines. Next, please. However, we have some information, we have more and more information on fixed foundation wind turbines, but we lack experience on floating wind farms, and we lack experience too on current turbines technologies. So this pathway which is proposed there, is faced with a number of uncertainties, a number of unknowns. For instance, in terms of environmental impacts, it is certain that floating farms, for example, have positive impacts in terms of location flexibility and distance to shore. This avoids a number of difficulties, especially with coastal communities, in terms of visual impacts, for example. But there are unknowns in terms of environmental impacts, especially regarding impacts on biodiversity. We have little information on that. We have little information on the impacts of wind farms on waves to the coast, to the shore. In terms of economic impacts, there are also certain unknowns. We know that wind floating farms, for example, permit to have turbines of bigger size and which increases the capacity factor. So this is a beneficial impact. Now we have also impacts on navigation in fisheries. We know little about that. And we have also to take account of the fact that wind turbines, generally speaking, whether fixed foundation or floating, are metal consuming. So we have little information on metal markets in the future, and we don't know exactly what would be the limits to the development of wind turbines because of problems with metal consumption. We have little information about that. We have also little information on the cost of current turbines. We are certain that series effects can decrease the cost of current turbines, but we have little information about how much, by how much the cost would decrease. So the pathway is subject to several uncertainties and unknowns. We need more knowledge to have a clear idea of what a blue growth pathway could be for offshore renewable. Next, please. So the conclusion is that any pathway option, and this is a recommendation, would require adaptability and monitoring. So monitoring is critical to shape a pathway for offshore renewables. In terms of environmental impacts, as I said, in terms of cost decrease, in terms also of hydrogen production, I did not talk about. Hydrogen production will be critical if wind farms are very remote from the coast. If the distance is important, cables are not efficient, and hydrogen production makes sense. So we need more information about that. And we also can recommend cooperation between the 5 Atlantic countries in terms of cooperation and common projects, especially in line with the maritime spatial planning and the recommendation from the Commission to increase the installed power of wind turbines in the future by building common project, hybrid project, as the Commission says, that is connected to several grids. Well, that's what I can say about offshore renewables and the blue growth pathway. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Regis. Thanks very much. We have a question, but before we come to that, I might just read out the results of our first 2 polls. So in terms of the poll on aquaculture, the highest response was that the cheap imported aquaculture products compete with local products. And in terms of the ports and shipping, the highest ranked challenge was adapting to climate change and decarbonisation. But Regis, a question for you that came up is in relation to floating wind. And it's do floating wind turbines offer the lowest associated negative externalities of all the offshore energy options that can be considered in Brittany, even if higher production and construction costs?
Excuse me, can you repeat?
Yes, yeah. Is floating wind basically the best option for Brittany in terms of negative externalities versus higher production costs and construction costs?
Yes, there is much uncertainty in Brittany. It's under discussion. On the north coast, a project which is now under construction is a wind farm, a fixed foundation wind farm. There are 2 projects not yet under construction for 2 floating farms to the west, near the west coast. But there are many discussions, and many debates in terms of the impacts of these wind farms. Actually, the fixed foundation project on the north coast has been cleared of legal action, but there were several legal actions against it. And there are still many, there are still discussions about the two floating farms near the south coast. So, it is certain that the regional authorities are very ambitious and want to develop wind farms and also to develop marine current turbines. This is really a political willingness of regional authorities. Now they acknowledge that there are problems with coastal communities. So the major problem is acceptance. Discussion are going on with local coastal communities, but they are not completely cleared. And there are also discussions with fisheries. Because, a detail that I did not mention is that a floating farm, has several anchoring lines under the sea, under the farm, and so a number of cables, a number of electric cables, so that it is almost impossible to fish. Fishing is almost impossible near and inside a floating farm. So this has more or less a sanctuary effect.
I think we've lost connection to Regis. I don't know if maybe we can move on to Francis anyway, if you're ready to go, Francis. And I'll just read out the last poll. The highest response was difficulty in assessing trade-offs between environmental benefits and the costs of offshore renewable energy. Okay, our final speaker for today is Professor Francis Fahy from NUIG, also affiliated with SEMRU. Francis has been involved in a wide range of projects looking at different issues, including sustainable development, using tools and indicators, community mapping, environmental governance, sustainable consumption, and for her sins, she's now leading a Horizon 2020 project called Energy Prospects. Francis and the team that you can see listed here were looking at sustainable tourism along the Wild Atlantic Way. So over to you, Francis. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Wes, for that introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to present today. As Wes mentioned there, today I'm exploring on behalf of the entire team at NUI Galway, comprised of geographers and economists. We're exploring Blue Growth Pathway for marine and coastal tourism trail development in the Atlantic area. And as part of the EU's Blue Growth Strategy, marine and coastal tourism has been viewed as one of the 5 kind of focused maritime areas with the potential to foster a smart, sustainable and inclusive Europe. However, while marine and coastal tourism are vital economic activities for a wide range of coastal regions across the EU Atlantic arc, this sector really faces increasing sustainability challenges due to increasing demand and the accompanying sort of social consequences for local communities, as well as environmental consequences for local coastal and marine resources. So the Atlantic Action Plan, which you've heard about today already, but and this focus on sort of promoting tourism products that build on the cultural and natural attractions of the Atlantic coastline has really resulted in this big uptake in interest in the development of sustainable marine and coastal tourism trails. And we define them, the definitions on the slide here. These trails, they seek to provide people with an exciting, immersive and educational holiday experience that is also of benefit to the local community and does not damage the local environment or society. So some examples some members of our audience here may be familiar with include the Welsh coastal path, which is a 1,400 kilometre stretch of Welsh coastline, the 2,500 kilometre Wild Atlantic Way, which is the focus of my presentation here today, on the west coast of Ireland. But there's also a number of shorter routes which might be familiar to some. These are particularly aimed at walkers. So I'm thinking of the 110 kilometre trail in southwest Portugal, or the 200 kilometre Galicia Lighthouse Way in northern Spain. So lessons can be learned from these developments to provide sort of good opportunities to deliver guidelines for coastal and marine trail initiatives that attract eco-conscious visitors, that also involve short supply lines for local products, and which foster environmentally friendly business models and practices. Now, as Wes has already clearly introduced, each of our case studies adopted transition management as a broad analytical framework through which to understand existing marine management regimes, and to try and stimulate thinking about how more sustainable regimes can be, if you like, realized into the future. So our case study, the Irish case study for the Moses project, really reports on research conducted on the Wild Atlantic Way. And when we think about marine and coastal tourism management in Ireland, I mean, our National Tourism Development Authority, Fáilte Ireland, really provides the primary support and management for the tourism industry in Ireland. And with a mission to sustain Ireland as a high quality and competitive tourism destination, collaborations with state agencies, local and national level representative bodies and tourism businesses, they seek to implement positive strategies for tourism businesses. In 2012, Fáilte Ireland led Irish efforts to repackage and really heavily promote the west coast of Ireland as a tourism destination, particularly to the overseas market. And they did this by introducing the development of the Wild Atlantic Way. As the world's longest coastal route, the Wild Atlantic Way follows the Atlantic coast all the way from Malin in County Donegal to Kinsale in the southwest of County Cork. And this established route really is an amalgamation of smaller roads and trails which have been used for over 150 years. The Wild Atlantic Way branding really seeks to highlight the wild and ruggedness of the West Coast by reconnecting heritage, culture and history of places with the actual dramatic landscapes found there. The Wild Atlantic Way has contributed to an increase in overseas tourists. It's reported in 2018 that Fáilte Ireland, they recorded a 6.5% increase in overall tourists to 9.6 million, and a 15% increase of US tourists to 1.7 million. When we think about adopting, a transition management framework within our research, what we did was we identified obviously a number of different key pressures on marine and coastal trail development in Ireland, and these are highlighted on the slide here. But we also undertook a number of interviews as part of our field work, and we talked to practitioners in the field as well as members of Fáilte Ireland about some of the initiatives and innovations that were occurring in the sector, which could help to alleviate some of these key pressures into the future. And one of these, and I've just given an example on this slide, is that Fáilte Ireland is currently developing visitor experience development plans centred around unique selling points in geographic areas. So basically, in the longer term, what these plans and what this innovation hopes to do is to entice visitors to stay in a geographic region of the Wild Atlantic Way for a longer period of time. So what we have potentially is an awful lot of people coming to visit the Wild Atlantic Way and hoping to do the Wild Atlantic Way in one trip. So instead of trying to, complete these sort of long stretches of the route in one go, this innovation or these plans are really trying to break up the route into more manageable regions and to try and entice visitors to perhaps have a more immersive and unique experience. And we have a quote here from one of the representatives from Fáilte Ireland who took part in the Moses Fields work. And they said this aim, these new plans, it's about bringing that cultural experience to life for the visitor. And getting the opportunity to immerse the visitor in those smaller towns and villages, so they're getting to see the little hidden gems along the route. When we think about our own case study and what we kind of the work we've conducted over the last 2 to 3 years as part of the Moses project, well, using both qualitative and quantitative research, we've undertaken sort of the team here in Galway developed an extensive tourist survey and conducted in-depth collaborative research with local communities situated on the Wild Atlantic Way. And the whole aim was really to identify the pressures, the preferences and the development trends that were relevant to coastal tourism and sustainable pathways for the growth of the tourism trail sector. First of all, to gain insights into the tourist experience of the Wild Atlantic Way and to concurrently assess the impacts of tourists, a survey questionnaire was developed and deployed face-to-face. The survey was designed to determine tourist characteristics, expenditure and activities during their stay on the Wild Atlantic Way. Respondents were also questioned about their perceptions of the Wild Atlantic Way, including things like quality of facilities and perceptions of levels of tourism pressures. The sample consisted of 603 tourists who were surveyed for approximately 10 minutes during the period of July 2019, and that's our obviously peak summer season here in Ireland. The surveys were undertaken in 6 different locations along the Wild Atlantic Way, and some of the core findings, I've just pulled out a couple of the findings from this survey. Our colleague Danny Norton has actually presented on the survey findings before, and a number of our previous presentations are all available on the Moses website if you'd like to check them out there. But some of the kind of highlights and how they relate, I guess, to the Atlantic Action Plan. The findings really found the data sort of indicated that some of the drivers of change in tourist insights were that the numbers of tourists, levels of kind of overcrowding and the quality of transport infrastructure along the Wild Atlantic Way. We were able to extract some of these interesting results, and as I said, I have presented them here, but they're available in more detail elsewhere. From our perspective then, we wanted to undertake an in-depth exploration of community perspectives on the Wild Atlantic Way. So we chose actually the community of Rathmullen, which is situated on Lough Swilly on the Faneuil Peninsula and along the Wild Atlantic Way in County Donegal. And as part of a collaborative research approach, we undertook a number of different methods of data collection over a 2-year period between 2018 and 2020 to try and gain a better understanding of the sort of impacts of tourism and the impacts of the Wild Atlantic Way on aspects of the community. So some of the things that we were involved in, we attended regular community organised and led meetings to address local concerns and discuss future developments in their region. We undertook semi-structured interviews with key community stakeholders and industry individuals, and we undertook participatory mapping workshops to learn about sort of community held values. In addition, we also undertook a range of sort of evaluated methods, including participant observation, assessment of community tourism behaviours, and also market opportunities. To give you an example of what some of this looked like on the ground, this is an example of an output from one of our participatory mapping workshops, which took place in October 2019. And the idea behind these workshops was to try and ascertain sort of community perceptions concerning tourism development along the Wild Atlantic Way. And this was undertaken, as I said, with the members of the Rathmullen community. We were very fortunate, and I'm going to discuss that in a minute, but within Rathmullen, there's an excellent group, The Way Forward, who worked collaboratively with us on developing this project. And they're an active group who were pre-existed prior to the project starting there. So these workshops, as I said, they were targeted at trying to garner information about community values and what was going on in this particular village with regard to the impact of the Wild Atlantic Way. So some of the prompts that we asked people to consider during these workshops where, you know, where in your community does the Wild Atlantic Way kind of demonstrate significant value? We're asking people about cultural value, recreational value. And another question was, where do you consider to be the most significant areas for the economy in your community? And a third sort of space that we looked at was, where do you consider to be the most significant areas of tourism? So we asked people to identify these, and you'll see just the outputs of those participatory maps here. We put them all together and developed a composite map of the different community values, and then we fed that into our framework, which I'm just about to discuss now. So this takes us to the actual development of the pathway for sustainable development of marine and coastal tourism trails. Our research and our particular case study, you know, what we wanted to do was sort of look at community generated development guidelines and to see how we could support, you know, sustainable coastal tourism as a sustainable pathway for marine and coastal trail development. So the development of guidelines that support sustainable coastal tourism requires close collaboration with communities that were at the community level. Locals at tourist destinations not only drive the tourism product itself, but they live with the consequences of tourist activities in their areas, and therefore they have increased motivation to develop and promote sustainable pathways. So integral to the development of these sustainable pathways is trying to capture local community knowledge in the planning stages, and that participatory mapping was one way that we you know, utilised within our case study. Working, as I said, with this group, the way forward in Rathmullen, we developed a community generated collaborative framework, which is outlined here in this slide. And the aim again was to overcome barriers and maximise opportunities in sustainable coastal tourism, and to try and assist in establishing innovations within more sustainable regimes. The foundation of this framework is comprised of two main components. The first is that the community themselves see a need. They identify a need. It's a real bottom-up approach within their own community. And the second is a little bit more top-down. It's the researcher, in this case NUI Galway, and the sort of collaboration of facilitated engagement. So this, I feel like, component could be comprised of local authorities, local development agencies, community planning, but together, and these two, I feel like, elements together, we get this transfer of knowledge from the sort of academic literature and best practice internationally was what some of the elements we brought to the table, and obviously the community themselves with the local knowledge and the articulation of what they value within the community. This led to sort of this generation of a pathway, as you can see in the middle of this particular framework, which led, and we're hoping is leading to informed decisions when we think about the future. So how does that translate, I guess, to the actual practicalities of the challenges facing a village like Rathmullen on the Wild Atlantic Way? The hope is that the process that we've utilised can translate community values and local knowledge into sustainable pathways. So the issues such as short tourism season, excuse me, and lack of accommodation were things that the community had identified prior, as I said, to the project beginning. And after sort of our ongoing collaborative development of these sustainable pathways in conjunction with the community, and the results derived from employing this framework included identifying a need and working collaboratively to address the following sort of pathways, and looking at providing improved infrastructure in the village, identifying responding to environmental damages in line with national frameworks and directives. And this is very important for people in that particular village, given the location and close proximity to Laxwilly, as well as identifying and developing unique experiences that draw and entice visitors to stay longer. So looking at what are the elements of that village that stand out, if you like, on the Wild Atlantic Way. While some of these pathways will obviously make sense and be relevant for other communities along the Wild Atlantic Way, the whole idea, I guess, is that the community, and any community, can utilize this framework to generate successful or sustainable pathways that are unique to them. And for other European regions interested in developing their marine and coastal trails and indeed marine and coastal tourism sectors in a sustainable manner, a large part of our report is focused in on the recommendations that might transfer to other communities and as I said, other regions. I obviously won't call them out here. They're all available in our booklet, which Wes has posted the link to, but one or two which might be worth sort of picking up here again. The Moses survey work suggests that the tourists taking part in marine-related activities spend more and stay longer than the average tourist. And regional authorities and tourism agencies should perhaps think about providing supports for the development of niche marine tourism product offerings in areas outside of the main destination points of the trail. And these niche product offerings should attract a potentially lower volume of visitors, but with higher expenditure patterns. Other recommendations can include to encourage ICT uptake in the area of sustainable tourism trail reusage. We're thinking here of trying to overcome some of the pressures of traffic and an awful lot of tourists in certain areas along trails. So an app providing real-time data on the current tourist numbers at key destination points along the Wild Atlantic Way could spread out tourists along the route and reduce overcrowding. As I said, there's a good bit of reading in our booklet where this is all detailed in greater depth, and I hope that's given a quick insight into our particular case study on the Wild Atlantic Way. Thanks again.
Thanks for that, Frances. Thanks very much. I'll ask a question while we're getting the poll up, and then we can go to a quick panel question as well. Two very interesting methods. I was just wondering, was there much of an overlap between what you found from the tourist survey and what were the values that were coming through from communities? You know, there's often this insider-outsider conflict, but does it really exist? Did they value the same thing?
That's really, really interesting. Whereas I haven't actually, you know, we're just looking now at the analysis of all the different elements. So we've analysed the elements, but I don't think we as a team in geography anyway have stood back yet and sort of looked exactly at what you pointed out there, because I do think that would be very interesting, and we do have that data. I just haven't analysed it across the different methods yet. But yes, I can imagine there should be overlaps. I can, but I couldn't speak with any great confidence at this point, having not analysed it yet.
Okay, sorry, I should have asked you beforehand. Okay, maybe we'll just go to the panel, and I'll ask one quick roundup question because we're running close to the end of the time. But all the presentations give a very good insight into working with communities and how Moses engaged with stakeholders. I suppose, you know, one question would be, how do we get stakeholders to think about these pathways and the value of engaging with communities, of thinking beyond the short-term interest and looking more long-term sustainably? So maybe we'll go on back to the start and start with Christina, and then Raula and Frances, give Frances time to think. But maybe, Christina, if you want to kick us off about, you know, the challenges or the value of engaging with communities in this kind of work, again, to think long-term.
I think, well, from the port's perspective, they've kind of worked maybe just within their industry for a very long time, and it's only now, and obviously with the harbour estate, it's not just the traditional port activities that they are now, you know, regenerating the waterfront. It's a mixed use area, as well as obviously the ports and shipping. So it's now seen as, you know, the contribution of the port to the wider city. So, you know, it's now beginning to realise that, you know, that what value of the port area, that region, is to that wider area, but also the wider communities. I think they now see the importance of, when they're planning for the future, that they're planning for the city as well and those local communities within that area. So by I think even having conversations with the port, you know, they've said that it's one of the, you know, their aims now is to, you know, engage with the local communities and a wider range of stakeholders. I suppose there's always been the same kind of stakeholders that they have they've worked with in the past, and I think now they're realizing that there has been people marginalized, but not intentionally, just, you know, now there seems to be a wider remit for the port. So I think it's very important they've realized now that bringing a range of stakeholders, it brings in a diverse range of views, but also more information, more expertise from different sectors that they maybe hadn't spoke to or engaged with before. And I know with Belfast City, there's, you know, they're looking at sustainability now and developing visions, and obviously there's climate change bill coming in. So the value of working with other groups and people with this expertise, it's a value to them. So I think with the transitions approach, and that they may not use a stakeholder arena or a transition arena, but they do see the value of bringing people together, I think, and looking at, you know, action research and that kind of co-developing some elements of the transition management approach.
Okay, thanks, Christina. Raula, if you're still with us, do you want to go next? And I'll just call out the result of that poll. The last poll, the highest ranked criteria was the need to reduce the footprint of tourism for it to be more sustainable. Raula, do you want to say something about engaging with stakeholders in terms of the aquaculture and how useful it was, or the value of it? Sorry, Raula, you're muted. Sorry.
Hi. Yes, it was useful. What we noticed, okay, we were not able to talk with every company in the Central region, but with the companies that we talked, they highlighted, especially some of them which are quite new, so they have the sustainability, the sustainable development profile. It's inherent in their from the planning stage of the company and in their business plan. So they were trying to engage with local communities through some activities. And this is also what we, from the study, what we recommend, that this could also be an indicator of the sustainability, the contribution to the blue growth from the companies, the engagement, whether they engage the local communities either by employment. I mean, most of the firms are family business and they employ people from the area. Then some bigger companies, they try to engage the local communities through some activities like educational activities, information. Some companies said that if they have some products that they are not very appropriate for sale, they offer to some associations and to the locals. So from this perspective, there is a very good interaction at the local level. But again, as we said, we need to kind of improve the image of the aquaculture sector, because still there is a lot of bias regarding the products.
Thanks, Rana. Francis, if you want to define words and engage.
Yeah, well, obviously it's the focus of our particular case study, and that really was our kind of concluding key piece of policy advice to others, is that really the benefits which can be gained from continued community collaboration they're really multiple, and we feel it's essential really from the onset, particularly when we're talking about tourism and you know, the local communities that are facing an awful lot of these related challenges, and that regional policymakers are really well placed, we believe, to undertake this kind of collaborative work and really benefit from the exchange of experiences of talking with local communities who are, as we said, driving the tourist product, but also living with the implications as well. So we see it as fundamental.
Okay. thank you to the 5 speakers. Regis isn't here, but thanks. I think that was a very interesting session, give a good flavor of what Moses is all about. We look forward to seeing you all tomorrow morning, all the attendees tomorrow morning at the Big Challenges panel discussion, which is at 9:30. And I hope you all enjoy the virtual cocktails or whatever you go off and do now. But thanks again to all our speakers. It was really useful. See you all tomorrow. Thank you.